Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this very timely event, Cultured Meats and Your Farm Business, hosted by the Royal Agricultural University. I'm Abby Kay, Deputy Editor of Farmers Weekly, and I'm going to be your chair this afternoon. I'd like to thank all of our speakers and all of you for coming along today for what should be a very lively discussion. First up, though, some housekeeping notes. We've got to do this, I'm afraid. Please do stay on mute through this event. There's going to be lots of time for discussion, and we want to hear your views. We'll invite questions after each speaker. Feel free to type them at any time as the Q&A box, though, and we can unmute you if you'd like to say more. If we do that, you'll be made a panelist briefly, just so that we can hear you. And that's nothing to worry about, and you've got nothing to do at your end. We will do all that at our end. This session is also being recorded, and that means that anything you say could potentially be repeated. We want everybody to feel free to share their opinions, but if you'd rather remain anonymous, you can submit your questions anonymously in the Q&A box, and we'll be sharing the recording with everybody in the next couple of days. This event is mainly for farmers, and it's about farming and cultured meats. There are clearly all sorts of other issues that link in with this, but I'm going to try and steer us clear of any rabbit holes. And given that these themes can get a bit lively, make sure it all remains polite. Also worth noting, we're going to be running a series of polls. These are just for the farmers in the audience. So if our other guests could just be aware of that and refrain from entering into those polls, that would be really, really handy. So let's get on with it. In recent years, billions of pounds worth of investment have been ploughed into the development of cultured meat by multinational corporations. And some of the big spenders have been vocal about animal agriculture, viewing it as a dying industry based on unethical principles. So it's only natural that farmers have viewed this growth industry with suspicion, fearing it has the potential to put them out of business while further consolidating the food industry. But what's the truth of the matter? Well, we've got some excellent speakers today who are hopefully going to help us bottom this out. First up, we have Tom McMillan. Tom is the Elizabeth Creek Chair in Rural Policy and Strategy at the Royal Agricultural University. As Creek Chair, Professor McMillan's role is to inform national and international policies on land, the environment and food. Tom is a founding director of the Centre for Effective Innovation in Agriculture and Deputy Director of the National Innovation Centre for Rural Enterprise. He's also an expert advisor to the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission and was one of the team who supported Henry Dimbleby to develop the National Food Strategy. Now, Tom, you are leading a very interesting research project, aren't you, looking at how farmers are going to be affected by cultured meat. Can you just give us the top lines about what that project is looking at?
Yeah, sure. So I'll run through it sort of more in the nuts and bolts later on in this session, but the idea is really to get a feel for what farmers think about cultured meat, where some of the concerns might be, but also thinking more in practice, working with real farms on how some of the kind of possibilities around this might play out on the ground. Because one of the prompts for this project and the discussion and the work we've been doing that we'll be sharing today is this idea that, as you said, you've got this big debate about the future of food and farming and livestock. This idea that if everyone in the world ate as much meat as we do here in the UK, then it just doesn't stack up environmentally. So you've got this big debate, but it's not a black and white thing. And how, if you imagine some kind of shift, some kind of transition over coming decades, how that happens massively affects what the environmental impact would be, what it means for our health, but also what it means for farmers, farming communities, the rural economy, and so on. And the prompt for this work was really that farming in rural bit is often missing from the conversation. And we wanted to make sure that when people are talking about meat alternatives and so on in general, but also specifically about this emerging technology around cultured meat, that farmers' voices were in the room, farmers' concerns were being kind of heard and understood and taken seriously. And also this technology is at an early enough stage that maybe the scope to shape how, if, and so on, it develops. So that's the thinking behind it.
Is this the only project then that is looking at that farmer specific angle? Because it's certainly the only one that I've been aware of. When
we kind of came up with the idea for the project, we weren't aware of much else going on like this. As we've gone about it, a few more examples have come out of the woodwork. So there's been quite a long-standing bit of interest, which Ikton and Marianne in particular are connected with in the Netherlands, about how, in a way, a different origin story for the conversation about cultured meat, which starts very much with how it could plug in with farming businesses and so on. So there's a sort of long running current of interest in this farmer side of it in the Netherlands, and then we've come across other projects in the US, in Canada, also looking at, I think, France, one based in Brazil, starting to look into, what does this mean for farmers and for the meat processors and that whole value chain as well.
So as you mentioned, you're going to be going into this in more detail later. Can you just give us a really high level view of what you're going to cover?
Yeah, so Marianne, who is involved in the project team and lots of other projects around cultured meat and is expert in this area, is going to talk us through the science behind it, the technology, and also the kind of case for, if you like. And then we'll hear from Ichtod and Evan, both farmers. Ichtod also part of the project team and also involved in cultured meat, so wearing kind of at least two hats at once, who will debate some of the opportunities and threats. And then you'll hear a bit more from me when I run through some slides sharing our research findings so far, which are from a whole set of focus groups we've been holding with farmers, covering lots of different sectors, different parts of the UK, and we'll share what we've heard so far from those conversations in terms of where people think the issues might be, the threats and opportunities, and get your thoughts as a group here today as to whether those ring true. And thanks to those of you who are here today who've also been involved in those focus group discussions. Great to have you involved again. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Well, we will be hearing more from you later. But next we have Marianne Ellis, Professor Marianne Ellis, who is going to talk us through the science, as Tom mentioned. So she is the former head of the Department of Chemical Engineering at the University of Bath. She's a chartered engineer with experience in bioprocessing for tissue engineering, and she previously commercialised this technology in cell therapies from academia to Cellas Limited, and seeks to emulate those successes with cellular agriculture. Marianne, over to you.
Thank you, Abby. I'm just going to share my screen, so just bear with me. Okay, let's just double check that that's showing okay.
I can see that.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to just spend 10 minutes talking to you today about a future with cultured meat. So as you just heard, I'm a professor of chemical engineering at the University of Bath. So I'm going to talk to you today about these kind of 4 areas. So first of all, I'll introduce to you the term cellular agriculture and cultured meat. And what they are, and just to put today's conversation kind of in a bit of context of the broader work that's going on globally. Then I'm going to talk about the need for diversification of protein production, and then move into actually how cultured meat is grown, both the actual process and also the supply chain, and then just touch on at the end where the cultured meat industry is globally at the moment. So first of all, the definitions that I think are important for the rest of this conversation. So cultured meat is actually a product of cellular agriculture, and cellular agriculture covers a lot of technologies that look to produce consumables traditionally made in livestock, using technologies such as fermentation or tissue engineering. And I'm just going to show you these 3 examples. So yeast is familiar for brewing, but it's also being used through precision fermentation to make oils and fats, and a particular focus here is for palm oil substitutes. You can also eat yeast as a protein food as well. Then something like mycelium, which is effectively the root structure for fungi. So here the cartoon of a mushroom. So the mycelium is grown. The product you've probably heard of is corn, and that's a mycoprotein, and the mycelium is basically treated and will become a protein product. for sale. So these are two slightly more simple cells than what we're looking at for cultured meat, where you grow muscle cells for to make protein. And these individual steps here I'll cover again in a little bit more detail. But muscle cells as grown in an animal start as immature, what we call stem cells, and have to go through a number of stages before we get the protein content. So collectively, these different approaches to growing different types of cells are called cellular agriculture. So as I said, cultured meat is a cellular agriculture product. It has all sorts of names, and these keep changing, and you'll hear today we use the name cultured meat, but cultivated meat, lab grown meat are also common names, and there's all sorts if you actually just Google the term. Now, in its basic form, cultured meat is a protein ingredient that is made up of muscle cells only. So we would take this population of immature cells from muscle and grow them up and mature them slowly through these various steps. They become more and more mature, and eventually they become muscle cells, as we would effectively see in a piece of skeletal muscle that lays down the protein. And I'll talk about the process in a minute. Now, there is a longer term goal to grow what we would call full cut cultured meat with the complex structure that results that you would find when you actually look at a piece of meat. Muscle's actually very complex. It's not just the muscle cells, you've got nerve, you've got blood vessels, connective tissue, and developing that is some way off. So the process I'm going to talk about in a moment is about making muscle cells as a protein ingredient, so pure muscle cells as a protein ingredient. But before I do that, I'm just going to touch on really why this field has picked up momentum and the opportunities from it. So when we are thinking about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and certainly the angle that I came into this field from is one of food security. And within food security, we need to recognize that different cultures around the world, in fact, different people within those cultures will need different types of diets, and that's whether they need it or what they have available to them, or from a cultural context as well. So when we think about looking at these alternative proteins, we're thinking of the global situation of food security. And if we take protein, well, first of all, take the fact that around 790 million people at this point in time don't have enough access to food. And yet the population is growing, and we're going to be looking at around 10 billion by 2050. Now, we have to acknowledge that the food system and food supply is really complex globally. But if we did the calculation to look at the amount of additional protein that the additional people need around the world, we're looking at something between 105 and 168 million tons per year of additional protein. And the protein production and access varies widely across the globe. We also have significant food waste. So the whole social cultural aspects also need to come into account here. So it's a very complex picture that we're looking at, and cultured meat will be, in my opinion, one part of this diversified protein source. So early studies have looked at the potential environmental benefits of growing muscle cells as a protein source. And just to highlight this kind of statement here is that really when we're looking at the environmental impacts, it's looking at what we need as humans in terms of food security, but providing that within the ecological constraints. If you're interested, I would just actually direct you towards YouTube and have a look at this triple bottom line, the science of good business, and recognizing, which basically talks through and recognizes the 3 Ps of planet, people, and profit, of how to achieve food security within the planetary boundaries to make sure that we're not basically depleting the Earth's resources, but also in a way that enables economic growth. So just taking cultured meats, and these are illustrative examples of the impacts of growing cultured meat compared to beef farming, I think it was in France. So land use reduction, about growing the cultured meat would require about 90% less land compared to beef farming. Similarly, would produce around 90% less greenhouse gases. Water reduction is around 50%, perhaps a bit less, and energy reduction, very, very actually hard to quantify, but we are looking at maybe reduction of between 10 and 50%. And that is coupled with the ability that we've got an alternative way to grow muscle cells. And the idea here is that there is potential for current farmers and food producers to perhaps take some cells from their animals and grow them up as additional income and an additional income source. But beyond that, actually, are the other components that we need to grow cultured meat, which is what I'm going to touch on next. So how is it grown? So I mentioned when we were looking at what cultured meat is that we need this input of cells. And they can be taken from the animal of choice, and how they're taken is very much up for debate. At the moment, our process is to take biopsies from recently culled animals that are in the food chain. So taking which animals are of interest, three here particularly of interest to our culture: chicken, because we eat a lot of it. Then for beef, because that beef farming has the highest environmental impact of the different meats. And pork, from taking cultured meat cells from pigs, because actually they happen to be the easiest to source. Now, as well as the cells, you also need to feed in what we call cell culture media. This is essentially a nutrient broth that contains sugars, salts, and other minerals and vitamins and proteins that the cells grow on. And that all happens in what we call a bioprocess, which essentially contains tanks that we grow the cells in, and controls the temperature and the rate of food supply and the rate of waste removal. That happens in, actually, we cover 3 stages. So what we need to do is take these stem cells, we grow them up in one type of media, so we get as many cells as we can. We then change this slightly so that we make them into mature muscle cells. And the final stage is the maturation, where we have protein laid down. That process in one reactor would take about 3 to 4 weeks. And the amount that you get will basically depend on the starting population of cells and how big your factory is. The output is then really down to the food producers as to what that could look like. And at the moment, we are expecting to see, or we are seeing, cultured meat as an ingredient combined with other food ingredients to make typically comminuted type products like burgers and chicken nuggets. We are very much hoping to see the industry move to more healthy food items, possibly a longer conversation. Also worth noting is that some of the waste products can be further processed or recycled, and that is a large opportunity both from an income perspective and also from an environmental perspective. So just in terms of the supply chain, again, this is where there's a lot of opportunities that we're still looking to understand, and actually part of this project is looking to understand. Currently, we get most of our supplies from research companies. It is possible, if you're lucky enough to have your own animals, and I work with Ilted, and we have had access to that. But ultimately, the ingredients are really quite expensive, and they're designed for research. So what we are looking to do as a community globally is to find specific suppliers for cultured meat that are food grade. So getting cells from specialist suppliers, or from local farms, or from a company's own animals, and then looking at the media supply, again, from specialist suppliers. But the exciting thing that we're looking at is how we could actually get media ingredients from cultured meat suppliers, but also looking at essentially what would be considered waste materials from local farms or from other companies that are making yeast or other types of product. So just to really wrap up very quickly in terms of the global industry at the moment, I've just picked 3 key points here. In 2020 in Singapore, they had the first regulations to be able to sell cultured meat, and that was in the form of chicken nuggets. The same company had a butcher set up in 2022 to sell the chicken nuggets. Closer to home, the Netherlands now have regulated tasting, but actually at the moment in Europe, it is not regulated to buy off the shelf. That's ongoing work. The US is a little closer. They're through the first step. So it's for sale globally, and regulation around the world is progressing. So just to summarize and say, this is really my case for cultured meat, is it provides a way to diversify protein production in particular, while reducing the environmental impact of the food system. It has the potential to provide added value or alternative products for farmers and food producers. And actually, I really do see this as a huge opportunity for the country as a whole, and that we as the UK could become world leading exporters of both cultured meat products, but also the technology. And at that point, I will stop and hand back to Abby.
Thanks very much, Marianne. That's absolutely fascinating. I believe that we have a poll coming, but just before that, if you do have any questions for Marianne, please do put them in the chat box. Let us know what your thoughts are. But we've got this poll here ready. So any farmers in the audience, please do get ready to vote. Poll 1, will it affect your farm business in the future? You can see the options you've got there. We'll just let that run for a moment. So, Marianne, while we're waiting for the results of that poll then, I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
Very much a layman's question. How long will it take you to grow a 500-gram pack of mince?
It's a very good question, and I'm going to unpick it a little bit actually, because I think there's a couple of things to pull out of that that's useful to know. So mince is it essentially has what we would say is that kind of that full cut meat structure. So it's not just pure muscle cells, and cultured meat in its first form will be pure muscle cells. So if I'll kind of answer the question in terms of the equivalent mass for pure muscle cells. So when we start with a cell population, a muscle cell population, they actually need to be surrounded by some other cells. So we have a minimum number of cells that we can start to grow. But if we just say we had enough of those to eventually produce that 500 grams, then those stages of going through the multiplication stage, the differentiation, so making them into mature muscle cells and protein production, takes 3 to 4 weeks. So once we are up to scale, you're looking about 3 to 4 weeks to go from immature stem cells through to your cultured meat at the end of it. I'll also answer the question based on what is currently, I believe, the world's kind of largest production plant, which is Ivy Farms, based near Oxford. So they are, I think this will give some good context to to guess where we are as an industry. So they are looking to produce 2 tons a year of product. Okay, so yeah, exactly. So anyone who knows about the production rates of meat going through onto our shelves, we know this is, it's a really small amount. This is a very early stage for the field. So whereas we can grow it quickly in terms of the manufacturing, that is actually the challenge as to how we can produce it at a scale. It's also likely, if I've got time just to say, it's also likely, in fact, it's guaranteed that it's not going to be pure muscle cells. There's going to be a percentage of muscle cells in a cultured meat product. we're not actually sure how much muscle cell content is in Ivy Farms product. I think this is also something that's important to us in an industry to understand, is what constitutes a cultured meat product on the supermarket shelf when we get there.
Thanks. I think the poll is going to be closing soon. There we go. We've got it. Okay, 40% of you think it's a threat and 40% an opportunity. That's interesting, completely evenly balanced there. And 20% of you don't think it will affect you at all. Right, really interesting. Marianne, we've got another question in the chat box for you from Daryl McLaughlin. He says, what about the nutrient density of cultured meat versus normal meat?
Yeah, a brilliant question. It's a really important part of the research we're doing at the moment. And so I would say across the UK. So what we are expecting is that it will be a complete protein like meat. So in terms of protein content, we are expecting it to be the same. Ultimately, it is the muscle cells that provide the protein in the meat that we eat. The other components, so the likes of B vitamins, for example, we are certainly to start with going to need to be adding those into the product. So the full nutritional analysis of pure cultured meat in terms of the cells is really about the protein, and then we need to look at how we can meet to match the good nutritional profile of meat.
What does that mean for labelling then, further down the line when this does become commercially available?
Yeah.
If the product is, in essence, going to be the same, should it be labelled as such?
A really good question. And I think that's actually part of this project that Tom's running and other projects, and is a lot of what we would call upstream engagement. So talking to not just farmers as we are today, but also other consumers and then supermarkets and the like, to understand how this should be labeled. So muscle cells are meat, so they are the exact muscle cells. We're taking a bit of meat from a cold animal that's going off to be prepared for the supermarket, and we're then growing just the pure muscle cells. But making sure we are transparent about the ingredients that have gone into making it, and also the ingredients in that product, are key. So I couldn't answer your question directly, but it's definitely part of the conversation that we need to have.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one final question, but if you don't want to use the Q&A box or the chat box, you can also raise your hand and we can unmute you so you can speak. But we do have one other question from Furkan. Is there research on production of animal fat along with muscle cells?
Yeah, good question. Yes, there is. There are companies that are looking at different animal fats. Actually, slightly easier to produce than the muscle itself. So recognizing that that fat is an important component of meat in terms of texture, and also carries certain vitamins. That is something that is being looked at.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Super helpful. We'll move on to the next session now, which is going to be a discussion between two speakers, Ichzod Dunsford and Evan Roberts. Evan is an NFU County representative, but he's asked me to say his views today are entirely his own and not that of the NFU. These people are both going to introduce themselves, their farms, and give a really short answer to the question, is cultured meat an opportunity or a threat? So we're going to get the farming perspective here. And afterwards, I'll have the opportunity to ask them a few questions to spark discussion among the wider group. So Ichzod, over to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Abby. You asked for a short introduction. I'm somebody who waffles, so I'm not sure I can do that. But nonetheless, I come from a farming family in West Wales, mixed family farm, 167 acres, very traditional small family farm. Diversified the farm business over 15 odd years ago into a meat processing business, specialist meat processing business, and went from supporting our own farm and the livestock that we produced to supporting about 19 family farms. And in the process of doing that, we went from a manufacturing business to being one in knowledge economy, where we were using the knowledge we had in meat science to support the development of food products. And for a range of customers, from sort of street food companies, food halls, Michelin-starred restaurants, all the way up to supermarkets, or those who made products for supermarkets. And it was while doing that research that I moved into the world of cultured meat. It was through a Nuffield Farming Scholarship in 2015, where initially actually looking at how to utilize co-products and byproducts from traditional livestock streams for food production, and wanted to understand where this sat within those kind of realms. And to be very, very quick in the answer of threat or opportunity, I think my mind was blown when I first sort of heard about it. Specifically, a quote from Churchill that he'd written in the 1930s, which I'll read now. "We'll escape the absurdity of growing a whole chicken in order to eat the breast or wing by growing those parts separately or under a suitable medium." And it was really specifically because at the time I was working in carcass balance, and that was transformative as an idea that we could actually produce the part that people wanted to eat. And I was really conflicted coming from an agricultural family, but I also felt that there are so many things that influence us culturally in terms of agriculture. There's so many things that we perceive as threats, and that as at the time definitely a lone agricultural voice in a new industry, I felt it was better to be part of the industry, to shape the industry, rather than for me to be on the sidelines screaming about it. So I was kind of looking at the positives to see where we could find the opportunities, rather than to set at that point that it was a complete threat.
Thank you, Ichthod. Evan?
Well, thank you, Abby. Ivan Roberts. I farm in Flintshire, North Wales. I'm a dairy farmer, actually. I'm probably you're wondering, well, why am I speaking on such a subject? But actually, it does affect us as well, which I'll go on to afterwards. Yeah, we're a family-run farm. My son's come home from university. We have a dairy herd that we are currently changing to a spring calving program to make the farm more efficient, and we supply a supermarket contract. We're in a Gloucester Welsh Government environmental scheme, and we have been for the last 8 years. Opportunity or threat? It's only recently I really looked into this, having been fortunate to have had an invite from this project to join a small group of farmers to discuss the project. And since then I've looked into it and read quite a lot. And from being very, from having big concerns about how it could affect the industry, I am now tending to think that, well, maybe it's not such a threat because of the hurdles and the obstacles that actually cellular meats have in the future. So I don't know, do you want me to go on about how I feel about, or are we going to?
That's okay, Evan. We can tease out your views through some Q&A. Just a reminder again to everybody else that you can get involved in this discussion. Chat box, Q&A, or raise your hand. Particularly interested to hear from people who are concerned about cultured meat and feel that it could pose a threat to their business. What questions do you have? I've got one to kick us off then. Do you think that these products will eventually put an end to animal agriculture? Ichthod, I'll start with you on that.
No, I think for me, I think going back to Marianne's presentation, I think the thing that really struck me, I came to this industry as well from a point of food poverty and how we produce food. So we already exceed some of Earth's resources or some of Earth's planetary boundaries in how we produce food. And so we have to do, as an industry, we have to be better in how we do that. So I'm not talking about meat specifically, I'm talking about how we produce food in general. And so the challenge is to feed everybody. And in order to do that, we need a set of tools to be able to do that. And this is just one of them. So it's not a kind of a replacement technology or something that's anti-animal. It's actually just another toolbox for us. And I think in the early days where even the name cellular agriculture and the fact that agriculture sat within that name, there was some opposition to that. But to me, these are all agricultural technologies in terms of how we produce food. Because in the end, I mean, we're very good at labeling ourselves as, you know, we were historically dairy as well. So my uncle would have called himself a dairy farmer, but it isn't, you know, yes, we farm, but actually the thing that we do is produce food. So I don't think we always remember that because we're so far removed from the consumer that we don't remember that specific point.
Marianne did mention a couple of the opportunities that there could be for livestock farmers in terms of bringing cultured meat to the shelves, but is that going to mean a reduction in the number of livestock that we have in this country, though? Is that the case? Even if it doesn't mean the end of agriculture, is it going to cut the number of animals that we have?
Potentially, yes, but I don't necessarily think that reducing animals in itself is a bad thing. And again, not coming from any kind of anti-animal perspective. It wasn't until coming from a farming family and having owned a meat business, it wasn't actually until my mid-30s that I even considered the question of should I or shouldn't I eat meat, and really considered the question, the volume of animals that we have on the planet that we raise specifically for meat. So it's really strange from a cultural perspective to even get to that age and not consider that. And you know, we have to recognize that none of our systems, I'm not talking just about agriculture, but none of our systems are perfect. So we need to change how we produce everything. That could be in transportation or in energy or anything. So so I don't think a reduction in animals is particularly a bad thing. I think what we need to be really doing is protecting our soils and how the ability that we have to produce foods for next generations. So yeah, I don't necessarily see reducing animals as a negative, but I don't think this is a replacement.
What do you think, Evan? Is reducing the number of animals a bad thing?
Yeah, I think we're in agriculture in this really long journey, and this is just the beginning of change. And you know, there's already industry leaders that are saying that we need net zero by 2040, and I think it's easily achievable. And you know, we have a good story to tell. We've got a good history to tell. There's the odd blip that things have gone wrong, but in general, we produce good food, and it serves the population well. And I just think that yes, this type of meat can fill some markets, but in general, I don't think it will affect livestock production massively, especially when the obstacles are from government, possibly from the consumer, you know, ethical concerns, and also the cost of the product as well, whether it could match the meat we already produce, the conventional meat that we already produce. And when I say match cost, that is the quality or the type of meat that is produced equally, you know, in these conditions. So yeah, I don't see a massive impact, but then again, it's difficult to decide whether it's going to affect certain sector or not, because we don't actually know what type of meat is going to be produced.
Well, I'm hoping to
thereafter.
hoping to come on to that shortly.
Yeah.
But first, another question for you then, is there actually a grassroots demand for this product, or is it something that's being pushed upon people by investors with commercial interest?
Well, the reality is it's available in one place in the world at the moment, that being in Singapore. And I'm actually, it's a really valuable question. I'm often asked about this point of kind of consumer perception or consumer acceptance of it as a food product. But until it's actually widely available on the market, we can't genuinely answer that question. I think for me personally, again, going back to that kind of food poverty point, I've always thought of this as a future technology to fill a gap where we need the high quality protein. And actually, Evan's point just now about quality, that's exactly it. You know, there's what this should be is something that replicates the high quality protein nature of what meat is at the moment, because it's a really important nutritious part of complete diets for us to have, you know, the bioavailability that's available in traditional meat products. So so yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, I personally, my first time I ever tasted it was in 2017. And it was, for me, especially considering I had a meat business at the time, it was the kind of final jigsaw in the puzzle to say it had the same taste, the same emotional response that I would get from a meat product. It wasn't an alternative. It tasted of meat. And so for me, it was kind of that final piece to say that, yes, this is something worth pursuing as a technology to consider. So if I can use my own experience, I think if consumers start tasting it, they'll be on board with it.
And linked to that then, is there a risk that this kind of product could further consolidate the food industry into the hands of a few big companies who are able to invest? I mean, I alluded to that in my introduction. Is that something that concerns you, Evan?
Which it just makes you wonder why do we want to invest so much into it when it's so much unknowns. Whereas if that type of investment, that amount of investment would be put into food wastage, global food wastage, then maybe we would be far better off in security-wise, food security-wise. And you know, I just don't understand why would we want to invest in another source of protein when really the markets are saturated with proteins.
Well, that is a good point. And I mean, coming back to what you were saying, Evan, about what kind of meat we expect this to displace. I mean, it's not going to be steaks, is it? It's going to be chicken nuggets, mince, that kind of thing. Is that going to have an impact on carcass balance, and how will that affect the supply chain?
Yeah, we're already seeing some sort of carcass balance changes with even the small rise in plant-based meat sales. So undoubtedly there will be, but the one thing I will say, we probably have I've thought to myself previously, I remember being sat after a meeting and I was in a cafe waiting for a train, and I remember doing a back of the kind of envelope calculation in terms of carcass balance to see where that shift is. But I think you need a mathematician to be working on this for a decent amount of time to actually really calculate it. But we have to also realize that livestock don't just produce meat. There are so many food products, there are so many cosmetic products, there are so many medical products that are reliant on the co-products that come from livestock, that just replacing one element isn't necessarily the point that tips carcass balance. It may actually move us back to the days where some of those co-products had real value in the meat industry. You know, it's because that we actually now produce on such scale of livestock that some of those items have been devalued because they're in excess. If the numbers were to be reduced, it would just rebalance what the value is in each of those animals. So it's far too complex for me to actually understand that. That's a question really to be answered by somebody that's able, or a team of people that they'll be able to actually dig into that.
Evan, did you just want to come back on that really quickly?
Yeah, so if you had identified that chicken nuggets and beef burgers are the ones they're aiming for, well, obviously big concerns for the poultry industry. And then for me as a dairy farmer, when a dairy cow comes to the end of her working life, then there's a purpose for her, and that is preliminary for a beef burger trade. And I just wonder whether, you know, one of the reasons for developing this type of meat is to reduce food wastage and that sort of thing. Well, it actually incurs food waste if we're not going to use our barren cows at the end of the day.
Thank you, Evan. Some really interesting discussion there, and I can see that the chat box and Q&A are now getting very full. I'm actually going to invite Tom to speak next, and then I'm going to have a big Q&A session with all of you ready to answer some of those questions at the end. So if I could ask Tom for you to jump online, please.
Great, thanks. And okay. Great, and so hello again, everyone, and thanks very much, Ike and Evan as well for those thoughts. Really helpful, and sets us up nicely for what I'm going to share now, which is in the work so far on this research project that we mentioned. We've been talking with farmers about cultured meat, and what I'm going to do is run through the findings so far, and then we'll use a few polls as we go to get a sense of whether these ring true with you. So this is one of this piece of work looking into what farmers currently think about cultured meat in the UK, is one of the first steps in the overall project, which is to build that picture of what these technologies could mean for farming. And I thought it'd be worth quickly sharing what else we're up to, so you've got the whole picture of the project and where this fits in. So at the same time, we've been asking farmers about what they think. Ike and colleagues have been looking into the current ingredients for cultured meat and whether more of them could come from farming, the kind of thing that Marion mentioned. Based on this, we're working out which types of farm are likely to be most affected, for better or for worse, and I'll share our first thoughts on that later on, and really keen for your feedback on whether we're looking in the right places. Then, and this speaks to some of the questions that were coming up in the Q&A as well, we'll be trying to update the impact assessment models, so those economic and environmental models that look at how cultured meat compares with livestock production and plant-based alternatives and so on. So, actually, how do they stack up environmentally and so forth? Then we'll put these together and work with 8 real farms on the details. So in practice, when you're looking at a real farm situation, not a kind of theoretical farm, how serious are any threats? And do any of the opportunities that that people have talked about really have any legs in practice? And of course, doing any of that properly relies on making some sensible assumptions about the wider factors that will come into play. So like carbon and carbon footprint of energy supply, the cost of energy, the global demand for meat, and so on. All those things are unpredictable. They're going to be different in 5-10 years time as these sorts of technologies start to potentially be a bigger deal. And so we're also in the process of pulling together some different scenarios for those future bits of the picture, like energy costs. Working on this with different farms in those different scenarios will give us an overall picture, a kind of heat map of the risks and any opportunities. And then finally, we'll use that to shape some recommendations through into the farming industry, of course, but also to policymakers and to investors to try and shape the development of this technology for the better. So it's really that bit on the left, those first 2 boxes, first 2 blobs there, that we're focusing on today. Here's the research team. So we've got some universities, but also some farming organizations, some consultancies. Cellular agriculture there is Ike and Marianne. And then we've got a wider network of industry and NGO partners who are involved in advising the project. It's funded by the UK government through what's called the Strategic Priorities Fund, where there's a whole batch of projects looking at how food systems are changing. And then here are the team who've been doing the work with the farmers that I'll talk through now, led by Louise Manning, who I hope has been able to join us just now, and my colleagues Lisa and John, also both here today. We've spoken with 75 farmers in 6 focus groups so far, covering a good range of sectors across the UK. They were still keen to speak to a group in Scotland and also make sure we've heard enough on horticulture and pigs and poultry. And thanks to Evan, you mentioned you're involved in one of the groups, and several other people who are here today who've been involved. So thanks again to you. So this is a first summary here of what we've heard in those conversations with farmers. And as you might expect, there's a good deal of concern and skepticism about these technologies, with the main issues being around quality and safety of cultured meat as a food, its impact on the environment, and concerns that it disconnects us from food production. Specifically on food, the farmers we spoke to raised concerns about food safety, about its nutritional makeup, whether nutrients would be bioavailable, so our bodies can take up those nutrients, and also that a concern that cultured meat would be sort of highly processed, with junk food in a way, about which there's also health concerns. On the environment, there were questions about, which we've also seen come up in the chat a little bit, and the Q&A, questions about the footprint of producing cultured meat and how that compared with traditional livestock farming, not only on carbon, but also for nature and biodiversity, and looking at all the different aspects of the whole product life cycle. And then there was this concern that it disconnects, cultured meat could disconnect people even further from where their food comes from animals and that relationship with animals, and from the countryside. And this was a really big theme, and what one farmer called cultured meat a perfect vehicle for further disconnection from food. The kinds of words that came up in these conversations, just briefly give you a kind of flavour of what was discussed in the groups. We got pretty strong language about the products, and also about the factors were driving the development of this technology and this emerging market. So that's just a snapshot. I'll come into the threats and opportunities in more detail in a minute, but I think we're just going to pause here for another quick poll. So back to you, Abby.
Fantastic. Have we got the poll popping up? There we go. Poll number 2, possible issues about cultured meat. Okay, so again, the farmers in the audience, please, which of these possible issues concern you? You can see the list there. While we are waiting for the results of that poll then, Tom, after doing all of this research, can you tell me what you think the biggest risk to farmers is from cultured meat?
I think I'd be slightly jumping ahead of my next slide. And in a way, for us in the project, it's early days. I think we're really keen to unpack where some of these issues are. So I think the stuff around carcass balance that Victor mentioned and Evan alluded to as well, with the cull cows and dairy, there's some complicated stuff to unpick there. And I think certainly my sense there's shifted a little bit so far already, but I don't feel like I know the full story. But it's shifted from going, well, maybe this could rebalance things, to then going, ultimately, if you've got a cheap source of mince effectively coming into the system, that's going to devalue things more. And the end result might be that you've got some restructuring, and the people left in the industry are producing smaller volume of higher value animals, but the effect has been a devaluation. So I think my sense of that as a potential opportunity has shifted to seeing that more as a kind of risk for current livestock farming, and also not only the meat producers, but also as everyone was saying, the dairy as well. So I think there's these kind of things we're learning as we go, reflecting on a little bit more, and the conversation with farmers highlight lots of really important issues on that front that warrant serious attention. And often, if this was left to people doing environmental assessments and economic modelling and sitting in rooms making policy, then these issues would be completely missed and sort of glossed over. So it's really important to get these points raised.
Good. Just a reminder that, you can still keep your questions coming in. Chat box, Q&A, or raise your hand. We are going to have a big discussion at the end with all of the panelists. I think that's the way we're going to get the most value out of it. I imagine we're going to be closing the poll shortly, but just a really quick one for you. Oh, there we go. It's closed. So we should be getting the results shortly. Okay, so the biggest concern is that it's going to be highly processed. Does that surprise you, Tom?
Not especially. I think that's something we'll come together a bit more in a minute. I think that idea that there's this question around what are we fixing a problem with the same thinking that caused it, in a way? That idea that you've got this tension and direction of travel for the food sector and farming between quality and provenance, all those sorts of things, and industrialization and centralization, and those coming into the conversation with the farmer. I think that's something we've seen, and whether these will basically be kind of increasingly sophisticated junk food, I guess, is one of those themes that comes up in the conversation with farmers, but also in the kind of wider public debate as well. So really interesting to see it come through here.
Yeah, I'm quite surprised actually that the 3 connection points, connection with animals, connection with countryside, connection with food production, that they are the lowest concern, because I often feel like a lot of this is sort of tied up with our emotional connection to food. So I'm quite surprised to see that they are among the lowest. I mean, there's still quite a sizable concern there for connection with animals and countryside, 44% each. But yeah, a little surprised by that myself. But I will stop jabbering and let you carry on, Tom.
Thanks very much. So just going on to the next slide. So in the group's discussions, as well as having that sort of top level, you know, where are you concerned and what are your questions about it, we also dug into the potential threats and opportunities with farmers in a bit more detail and thinking about the implications for different sectors, different farming systems, and I'll run through some of the main ones here. So the way this is set up is on the left, you've got issues that would affect specific types of farm. And then towards the right, you've got issues that would affect the whole food and farming system, and obviously the kind of threats at the bottom and the opportunities at the top. So we heard about the point that Eva mentioned, that the potential indirect threat to dairy from cheap beef affecting the value of cull cows and that sector more generally. You got from livestock farmers more generally about the knock-on effects on carcass balance, like Icted raised. And as you mentioned, with the effect of plant-based already, you know, that what that can mean is that the economic impact of something like cultured meat can be bigger than the direct kind of volume and value of what they substitute for. So you get this sort of potential amplification of an effect, which could play out okay, or it could play out as really quite a big risk. So you had concern about that. Concerns about grassland being abandoned, and questions over whether that kind of outcome would achieve what environmentalists are looking for in terms of biodiversity benefits and rewilding and so forth. Got the concern that if you had a really rapid change and this sort of thing really took off, then would you get mass culls and so on within the livestock sector? But you've got concern that cheap meat alternatives could undercut UK livestock production that has high welfare by global standards, and so you end up with more of the meat on the shelves being low welfare imports. And this plays into that that kind of debate about what are we comparing, what's being substituted for, if that's what's going on here, and also what are you comparing when you're looking at those environmental and economic assessments and so on? Are you comparing UK production or the kind of global market and global products? You've got then the kind of wider issue of any effects on the rural economy of a decline in livestock farming, and then even wider concerns that this furthers what we've seen as sort of worrying trends within our food system overall. So power and control being more concentrated in a few big companies. In particular, this idea of Americanization, which came through as quite a big theme across quite a few of the groups, of a sort of US influence on our food system and culture, whether that's from kind of Silicon Valley money and tech bros or whatever driving that concentration in power, that's a concern, to that sort of highly processed food concern. So processed foods becoming the norm, with the sort of taste and flavor expectations that go with that, but also the industrialization too. So it's Americanization, and then linked to that, this idea that the meat might be nutritionally inferior to meat from livestock, even if superficially and on a packet or whatever it might show up broadly the same or even better. Sort of behind it, the subtleties, things we don't really understand, might not be as good. And then there are some sort of questions and uncertainties, that bit in the grey, debates within the groups, requests for better information, and some of which again we've seen coming through in the chat and Q&A around food security and sustainability in particular. And so Farmers We Spoke To didn't rule out completely that cultured meat could help on these counts, albeit at the cost of some of those threats I just ran through. As one said, if it does provide protein and nutrients to a population that can afford to buy meat, then I think that would be a good thing. But equally, people weren't sold on it either by any means. So, for example, were the life cycle assessments that were being done, the environmental assessments, fair and accurate? Were they realistic in the assumptions they were making about how farming systems actually operate, or were they, imposing a sort of data from US or Brazilian or wherever else in the world, their ways of farming onto the situation here in the UK, and making assumptions didn't really ring true. And likewise, were they taking into account any differences in nutritional quality between livestock meat and culture meat? And then even if you could make more food this way, how would that play out for food security if it is highly processed and if it was controlled by a few companies? So again, that that sort of sense that maybe it's not about producing more and more efficiency and so on. It's also about who's in control and the quality of what the food is. And then when we get into the potential opportunities, which you won't be surprised is a shorter list, we see things like this discussion that Marion raised and you touched on as well, of opportunities to supply raw materials and some interest in that from, for example, arable farmers producing feedstocks to some of the high value ingredients that might go into the growth media or to cell lines. So again, as one farmer put it, if they want to contract animal cells, I'll sell them that. So it wasn't like a closed door necessarily to those opportunities. There was a degree of confidence as well from pasture fed producers and people with sort of a traditional livestock proposition, if you like, meat proposition, that this kind of thing just strengthens the market, strengthens the USP for the real stuff, again, as one put it. And while this is generally seen as a technology for large scale centralized production, the idea that you could see cultured meat production on farm, which is that vision that I mentioned right at the start, is particularly kind of part of the story in the way that this is thought about in the Netherlands. That wasn't entirely ruled out. I think it was seen as sort of relatively unlikely, but not entirely ruled out. And then finally, despite that big weight of concern, several groups raised the idea that something big needs to change to address the big challenges around food and farming. As one farmer said, what we do know is that we're all doomed unless we find some game changers. So this idea that we're sort of fiddling at the edges when it comes to dealing with issues like climate change, or what someone called the slow motion car crash in health. This sense that some big and potentially disruptive change probably is coming and may even be needed in some sense. But this question mark over whether cultured meat is a game changer like that and helps do that job, or whether it's actually more like business as usual, more of the same thinking that kind of got us into this mess in terms of, you know, that picture of power and control and ownership and quality and things within the food system. So lots there to cover, which I rattled through, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. They've been really, really rich discussions where people have raised lots of thoughtful points. One of the things that really struck me is how, yes, there's obviously a lot of stuff down in the orange bit at the bottom, lots of serious concerns that farmers have about the technology, but this isn't simply a kind of knee-jerk reaction to the competition it might pose livestock farmers, which is sometimes, if you sort of think about the public debate and about meat versus meat alternatives and so on, often that's how it's sort of set up, is a battle for the market, and what these conversations shown is a much kind of richer set of issues, a more important set of issues, as well as those to be considered, important alongside those to be considered. So they're all points that need serious understanding and addressing. On the concerns like consolidation of power, it's interesting to think where there's potential common cause with exactly some of the people who are also promoting cultured meat. Those are sort of shared concerns. And then on others like carcass balance and then these points raised by farmers are bringing really important and often missing factors into understanding how the impacts could play out. So I'm going to hand back to you, Abby, I think, for our next quick batch of polls.
Fabulous. Okay, you should have had that one popped up on your screen. Again, farmers only, please. Poll 3, threats for your farm business. Would any of these threats affect you? Okay, so while we're doing that then, I mean, the threat to the rural economy, I find that really interesting, and presumably that's worthy of some separate research in itself, or are you going to be building on that about whether there is the potential for the rural economy to be hurt by this, Tom?
Yeah, well, I think we'll in the work we do with specific farms in the next phase, then we'll get into that a little bit, because we'll be able to look in the cases where this looks like a big part of the picture. We can start to look at the knock-on effects. So some of the examples will focus more on testing out whether there are potential opportunities, and some will focus more on exploring the scale of any threats. And on the threat ones in particular, it's good to understand any knock-on implications as well for suppliers and so forth. But there's an area which is by no means unique to this issue. So there's other work on how, even though in lots of places the farming as an industry shows up as a relatively small part of the rural economy by value, you've got these connections into the sort of fabric rural communities that can make changes in farming, for example, in dairy in the southwest or whatever it might be, actually have these really big knock-on effects that go far beyond what you might expect if you're sitting looking at it over a computer and just looking at the total number of the total sort of scale of turnover, if you like, as a proportion of the rural economy's turnover in the farming industry. I see Evan's got his hand up as well. Abby, I don't know.
Yeah, I've just seen that. Evan, you want to dip in there?
Yeah, just on that, it's the wider picture as well. If the countryside, looking at Wales now in particular, we've got the landscape. We've got that landscape that's been made by livestock actually over hundreds, thousands of years. And when you lose those sheep off the hills and the dairy off the lower land, you start blanket growing trees or whatever, or maybe the tourism will be affected. So it's not just our industry, it's other industries as well. And like back in Wales here, 2/3, 3/4 of the land is marginal land. We can't grow crops and things like that on them. So we have to have livestock. So when something like this comes along and affects our livestock industry, there's massive effects on other industries. And you will recall, Abby, there was a survey done by the NFU once on how much of the subsidies that farmers receive actually go into the community around the farmers. And in here in Wales, for every £1 spent on a farm, £7 was spent in the community from farmers. So there's massive implications if livestock weren't on the land.
Yeah, thank you, Evan. I can see we've got poll 4 up now on opportunities for your farm. So if the farmers want to fill that one in, and I'd like to move the discussion on to open it up more widely, but we just need to let Tom finish his presentation first. So maybe while that poll's running in the background, Tom, I'll let you continue.
Thanks. Sorry, I couldn't see my microphone for a second there. Thanks, Abby. So they're good to do them at the same time, because tons of stuff coming through the Q&A. It'd be really good to spend time on it. So just to end, I wanted to share our first thoughts on which types of farm it might make sense for us to zoom in on in the next stage of the work, and to really understand the threats and opportunities in a bit more detail. We'll be looking to team up with 8 different farms. Like I said, 8 just gets a doable number, but quite a lot, to think through how their business could change in a world with cultured meat, and to get a measure of the impact. And that will involve, when I say teaming up, what do I mean? I mean, the idea is to actually work with individual, actual real farms in some of these different areas. And we'd provide a team of specialists to help with mapping the farm resources and supporting some conversations with the farmer about, what cultivated meat might mean in terms of opportunities and threats, and what they might want to do with it. And analyze that a little bit, also involving a consumer focus group. And then we provide a budget of 1,500 quid to cover the farmer's time and other costs as well. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, then it should be quite a nice opportunity to get stuck in and have that the cost of doing so fully covered. So here are the areas we've been thinking about. I won't run through them in detail, but you can leave this up. But it's really trying to cover off a range of those different potential issues that might come up around the sort of competition, the carcass balance aspects, the flip side of the competition, the competitive advantage, if you like, from those the pasture fed and so on, that cell line supply idea, the potential kind of markets, new markets for particular ingredients, whether that's from dairy, from fruit and veg and so on, and then the kind of maybe more large scale commodity ingredient supply, where all the questions about the spec and so on are all emerging, and will be the types of things that we're looking into in this project. And then finally, you got that one there about if there's any potential for on-farm production and waste reutilization as well. So those are, if you like, that's our start of a 10 on the farms we thought we might look into, and we're really interested in hearing from people who are keen to be involved, and we'll be getting in touch afterwards about that opportunity. But the reason there's more suggested here that are about opportunities than there are about threats isn't because we think there are more opportunities than threats, is because in a way the opportunities are more diverse, and we want to get to the bottom of whether any of them can have legs at all. Whereas on the face of it, the threats seem perhaps, some of them need unpacking, but they seem perhaps more widespread, but also more generic. So that's what we found so far, and where I'll stop. Thanks so much for listening, and it's been really good to see the Q&A comments coming through. And I'm going to hand back over to Abby for our discussion now, and where we've got tons to cram in. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Tom. Super interesting. And if you do have any views on which farms Tom and his team should be focusing on, you can see the list there. If there's anything else you want to add, let us know in the Q&A, in the chat box, or speak to Tom afterwards. So we can see the results now of poll 3, threats to your farm business. Highest there, grassland being abandoned and carcass balance then. But yeah, there's people feel that these are all a threat to some extent. That's interesting result. I think we've got all 3 results coming up. There we go. Poll 4, opportunities, stronger USP for grass-fed livestock. That's interesting. On-farm production of cultured meat, less so, and supply of materials for cultivated meat, less so as well. And poll 5. Mainly a threat, little impact. Okay, so mainly a threat and little impact are at exactly the same percentage. It seems to be a running theme that people are just completely divided down the middle. Mainly an opportunity and could go either way, both at 17 as well. Interesting. Right, I'm really keen now, because we've only got 15 minutes to open up this discussion more widely. We've got lots of questions in the chat and Q&A box. I'm going to go first to a question from Elliot Beebe. Catherine, if there is anybody with their hand up, please can you let me know? But Elliot Beebe's question, okay. Let's assume that various barriers are overcome to allow cellular agriculture to be conducted on farms. Are there any reflections from Ichtod and Evans on who would own the cellular agriculture technology / equipment / intellectual property, and how this might affect their businesses? Ichtod, I know that you have got some views on this because we've spoken about it before. Do you want to jump in on that?
Definitely, yeah. So as it currently stands, the tech companies that exist, they follow the Silicon Valley tech model. So patenting and trademarking and intellectual property is kind of a key part of how those companies raise investment. So currently it's in the hands of those companies. However, I think, and part of the reason why we were so supportive of having this particular project is actually we need to open the conversation to how can others be part of that kind of ownership model. So ultimately, if we're producing from a cell, the cell comes from an animal, and it's from livestock who somebody owns, generally a farmer. So why shouldn't that be a licensing opportunity for the farmer in terms of that original cell population? And then, I mean, we probably haven't touched it enough. I was surprised at one of those polls just now in terms of one of the opportunities coming from agricultural inputs. It's really important to state how essentially we're feeding, in the same way that we feed cattle, we're feeding a cell in this process. And so the nutrients that a beef animal would need are the same nutrients that the cell needs. So there's a real need to find those from primary agricultural products, as well as the waste streams that come from the agricultural industry. Again, it's the agricultural industry has the opportunity to have a hand in that and have a hand in ownership of that. Which again, purpose of this is that if we can start opening that conversation, we might mitigate that risk of that kind of globalization piece that's been asked in some of the other questions.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I'm going to go straight to the next question just for time purposes. Louise Manning, you've got your hand up.
So I was just going to add to that previous question. So my point was that we already have a whole range of supply chains where the farmers do not own the IP. So if you think of broiler chickens, for example, the IP is held by a large number of breeder companies. So it's not unusual for farmers to be involved in enterprises where the IP sits outside their hands. But within this within this process, there is the opportunity to change some of the dynamics of that with cultured meat.
Anybody want to come back on that, or shall I move on to the next question? Okay, I shall move on. Got a question here, a couple of questions and a statement from Pat. So Pat says, as a farmer born and bred, I first of all take issue with the word agriculture being linked in any way to what is obviously a manufacturing business. Has a totally reliable carbon calculation been established and verified? So Tom, I guess I'll come to you on the first point about the word agriculture being linked to a manufacturing business. Is this something you've come across before? And on the carbon calculation, who wants to take that one? Should we go to Ichtod perhaps on that first?
Yeah, maybe could you want to comment on both actually?
Yeah, that's fine, Tom.
I was actually going to ask Marianne to cover the one on the calculation, because she's had a hand in doing life cycle analysis, so she'd be better place for me to answer that particular question. But
Fabulous.
I'll happily add to Tom's answer on the agriculture point.
Well, on the agriculture, and I think and I was really interested in your reflections earlier on that, that you know, as a farmer, you see it slightly different from that in a way, yeah, I mean, you've got both the kind of debates about language and what this is called that are happening within the cellular agriculture, or sorry, within the cultivated meat industry, and which are as much about meat as well as about is it called meat and so on, which are partly about how to sell it and so forth, but also as those translate into debates about labeling, and the versions of those that are happening in different countries as well. So, you know, in France, the debates about what, you know, labeling a plant-based and so on as meat and so forth. So you've got all these kind of complicated claims and counterclaims that link to do with the link into what both, you know, farmers' understanding of themselves are and of their communities, and sort of who owns these concepts, and also into what consumer and public understandings are of the terms, and wanting to be sort of truthful, not misleading people, yet at the same time not seeing these things as stuck in time, set in stone or whatever either. So yeah, but I think it's, yeah, I think they're really important to debate, really hard to figure out what, you know, what to do about how this language evolves.
Yeah. So I'm going to give an additional politician's answer to this one as well, because my I don't think it's a right or wrong whether we should use that term or not, and the reason being is that my own personal journey into this field is very very representative of how lots of people in the agricultural community deal with things. So you're born into agriculture largely. It's a really emotive industry. It's very personal. Anything that's different or critical, it can feel really personal. And so there is passion when it comes to these debates around language. And that's obvious. You know, that's something that we're fully going to expect for a term that feels to be misappropriated. So I just think this forum and what this project is doing is fantastic in that we can actually have those conversations, because I think they need to be had in order for us to see how we use language in the future. Because I'm personally, I don't like when language that I find friendly is misused by another industry. So and you know, I understand my own personal reflection on that use. So it's better to get this conversation out there and for us to find how we use language, rather than saying that this is wrong with it, this isn't.
Excellent. I think we've lost you there. Marianne, do you want to come in on the carbon point?
Yeah, sure. What was the exact question, Abby, on the carbon?
The question was, has a totally reliable carbon calculation been established and verified?
The short answer is no, in terms of totally reliable. So, and I'm being very kind of academic about those those terms totally reliable, because what we need to be really careful of is any life cycle analysis that you read, you have to look into the details of it, and actually it becomes very specific to the system that's being studied. So you can't reliably apply the current life cycle analysis to every cultured meat production system and every farming system. So they are reliable when you look at the details of what they've studied. The point we need to get to is being able to look at a particular cultured meat manufacturer and their life cycle analysis, and also a particular farm and their entire process as well, and then it becomes reliable. So this project is, as Tom said, looking at part of this, and what we hope is that the information gathered from this study and many others is that we can start to build those so that we can get really useful life cycle analyses. Now, what's available we can use as tools, and they will give a kind of broad indications of where we need to look at improving the environmental impact of the current cultured meat processes as we know them. But yeah, it's a tool and we need to use them with caution, for sure.
Thanks, Mary. And perhaps another one for you actually here from Alistair Armstrong. Is this safe to eat? Scientists have been playing with agriculture for years and had a negative impact.
So I haven't eaten it. I'm not a regulator. I don't work for the FSA. My personal opinion is that yes, it is, and I'll tell you why. Because muscle cells grown for cultured meat are in an extremely sterile environment. They have been taken from a piece of meat that is going to the supermarket that is safe to eat because that's what we buy and eat. They are grown using media that is sterile. So in terms of the kind of, if you like, the risk of infection or otherwise, it's a very controlled system, and it's muscle cells. So from my perspective, I would expect that cultured meat will be considered safe to eat in Europe, as it has been regulated in the likes of Singapore.
Thank you. Another question from John McLenahan. If the research and investment was put into improving genetics and efficiency and reducing existing levels of waste, would this not be more effective in terms of addressing global issues? Ichtod, I'll come to you on that first.
So there are probably two things here. And one is actually that we have a lot of answers in terms of how we feed people on the waste point. You know, we produce a lot of food already. We do need to be better at how we do it. But a lot of the problems we have actually relate to how we as consumers actually make choices, and changing people is very, very difficult. So our lives now are very different to what they were 50, 60 years ago, and where food sits within our value is really quite different. So yeah, we probably have some easier routes to fixing some of our problems, but that would involve human change, which is difficult. In terms of research and investment, again, political answer here is that I actually think we need more money for all of these things, because we are facing a huge amount of problem. So climate change in itself is going to have a huge impact on the agricultural industry and how it currently produces food. And even if we look at something like coffee and chocolate, the areas in which those are grown are very, very specific in the world. And with climate change, I'm not quite sure where we're going to be producing those. And if consumer demand is there for those things, it'll be things like the market that will then determine that we need to find an alternative to produce those things, rather than, and again, that comes back to human want as opposed to human need. So it's a difficult one. We know we generally, as the same way as in politics, we generally if we think of governments, they aren't necessarily doing what is right for everyone. It's more party political and what the opinion is from one side or the other. And that's the same situation that we have in terms of where we're going with as a global population.
Thank you. Tom, I can see you've got your hand up. If you could be very
Yeah.
brief as we're
Okay,
running
just-
close to
just-
time.
Well, just to pull together quite a few sort of thoughts that are in the Q&A, and also some that I know that only the panelists can see that are in the chat as well. So the point from Josh about more generally the need for better carbon calculations in agriculture, so not just for cultured meat, but also these discussions about power of food supply going into the hands of fewer people, something in the chat about big pharma and big tech and so on as well, and these concerns. And what they flag is how so much of what one makes of this technology, but also a lot of these questions about what makes most sense environmentally and socially to do for the future of our food and farm system rest on those big assumptions about how the world works and what's most plausible. So when you're looking at carbon footprints and things, what assumptions are you making about whether it makes sense to look at footprint the product per kilogram, or whether you're looking at the footprint of a farm business, assuming that those are pretty static, or whether you're looking at the footprint at a kind of landscape scale and thinking about land use change and all those sorts of bigger shifts. Likewise, what assumptions are we making about how people's diets might change globally, how our norms might change? Those massively affect do we think people are likely to change their habits? What part do changes in if you like product substitution, changes in technology play in either meaning we don't have to change our habits so much, or changing our habits for us? All those sorts of things, those assumptions about what's most likely, what's less likely to happen, where are the things that are easy to change, where are the things that are hard to change socially and politically, massively come into play. We were in some of us were in a conference the other day where George Monbiot had been speaking. He's obviously quite sort of vocal about, not about this culture meat, but about precision fermentation. And he was saying, oh well, making the environmental case for it and so on, but then say, well, it relies on antitrust, global changes in antitrust law to stop all the power getting consolidated in the hands, and changes in intellectual property law, and those might seem quite far-fetched, and so it all comes back to a lot of these assumptions about, is it easier to change the law globally, is it easier to change people's diets, is it easier to change farming practices and food industry practices? And a lot of that, in a way, the assumptions you make about that are probably more important in answering some of these big environmental and sustainability and food security questions than the kind of the numbers and the nuts and bolts and the sort of scientific, the technical answers. It's more about how, what assumptions we make about how the world works, I think, is what partly kind of comes through in these conversations with the farmer groups as well.
Thanks, Tom. That's really helpful to pull everything together. This has been such an amazing discussion, and I'm really sorry we don't have time to answer any more of the brilliant questions that you've put through. But we have heard views from right across the spectrum of opinions today. I guess if I could leave you with one key takeaway, it would be this, and that's to keep this conversation going. So speak to your family, speak to your friends, speak to other people in the farming industry, and ask them to join the conversation as well, because cultured meat is coming, whether we like it or not. We have to make sure that farmers' voices and concerns are at the forefront of that conversation. So in that spirit, do please make sure that you take part in the next phase of Tom's research. Information will be sent out with the recording over the next few days about how you can do this. And from a Farmers Weekly perspective, I'd also be really interested to hear your thoughts on this subject. So please do get in touch with me. I can see there's a lot of strong opinion on this. So there's nothing left to say, but thank you again to our speakers and to all of you for coming. I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Erin, everyone. Thank you.